Welcome to the To Be Honest podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dianne Chung, who will be sharing about her experience with sexual assault and trauma, as well as how her life experiences overlap with growing up within a Korean American family. Dianne is a 2019 graduate of UC Berkeley, where she studied biology, peace and conflict studies, and journalism. Currently, she works as an automation engineer and is passionate about addressing Asian American hate, sexual assault, and misogyny. She also is learning how to rollerblade and enjoys spending time with her cat, Marble. So welcome to the podcast, Dianne.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I like to ask every guest when we first start, to be honest, how are you feeling today or doing today?
Well, to be honest, I am actually doing pretty good. This week has been going smoothly in terms of work, and I had a little bit of a rough week last week, but I think that right now things have calmed down. So finding space for myself has been important.
That's good. I'm glad this week is a little more calm for you. Are you working remotely currently? What's your situation like?
No, so I actually go into office and I work in a lab at the moment, so tend to go in Monday to Friday, and it's been actually really nice having the commute. I used to work from home at my previous job, but getting that spatial difference between work and home is actually giving me more of a balance than I did have before. So work-life balance has been a lot better since I started at my new job.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's so funny. Like during the pandemic, I was like, yay, like work from home, like it's awesome. And then once I got back to the office, I was like, oh, it's kind of nice having a routine and like a schedule that I'm sticking to. It's a little healthier
Absolutely.
sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did want to start our conversation today by talking a bit about the sexual assault that you have experienced. So as a survivor, would you mind sharing a bit about your experience?
Yeah, I mean, before I even talk about my experience, I find it almost interesting that um, a lot of times I feel like when people talk about being a survivor, it assumes that it's only happened once, but actually on my end, it's happened more than once. And I oftentimes when I get asked this question, I have to figure out navigating which experience to talk about. Um, And like I've even seen this Instagram video where a speaker is like asking a crowd of women and seeing if them or if people they know went through such an experience, and almost 100% of all the women stood up. Um, but in terms of my personal experience, I don't want to talk too much about the details because I don't think that's as important. But it did happen when I was in college. I was at this semi-professional retreat slash conference. Um, but I've also had it happen in my own home space during college as well. I think the reason why, not that there should be a reason behind why sexual assault happens, but I've actually been reading a book right now called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's talked about in one section about how oftentimes survivors might find themselves in the same scenario unconsciously and subconsciously because when trauma happens, survivors try to overcome that trauma by going through the same exact scenario and seeing if they can actually be the quote unquote winner in this scenario. And so reading that now, I kind of, relate it back to my own personal experiences where the first time I had my traumatic experience, it was, very scarring, but then it was so weird to me how I kept finding myself back in similar circumstances or in similar situations, even though I was trying to be diligent and aware. And so there's a lot of, I guess, thoughts I've been having around that, some shadow work on that. Um, but yeah, just realizing now that even though it's happened, now that I'm able to realize that, subconsciously I might be trying to fight against this circumstance that's out of my control. It's made me more reflective on those experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing a bit about your experience. I definitely want to check out that book that you mentioned. It sounds like a really great resource. Sounds like it's helping with your journey and your healing, which is nice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so after you went through these experiences, how are you feeling emotionally and mentally?
Emotionally, I ended up suppressing a lot of my reactions, all of my anger, sadness, and fear. It had actually vanished after what had happened. In fact, what I felt more was a numbness towards the experience. And I just pretended like everything was okay, that I hadn't gone through such a thing. I just pushed the memories back and moved forward. Unfortunately, though, even if the mind does react in that way, I discovered, at least from my personal experience, that my body still remembered what happened, and also subconsciously as well. And because of that, I was actually diagnosed with PTSD. um, I went in to see my primary care physician, and she noticed that there was some issues with my lab work, that I had a pretty high um, cortisol level. And so that's usually indicative of being chronically stressed. And that was something that I hadn't had before my incident. Not only that, but I developed a condition called central serous retinopathy. And usually with this condition, it's actually diagnosed in demographically like older men in their 50s who are workaholic and are alcoholics, and they do a lot of stress inducing things on their body. But I was actually diagnosed with it, and it made my left eye go completely blind. Like I could not see out of my left eye. And so I was partially disabled for almost half a year. And that was actually the biggest wake up call for me. It was this physical manifestation of my emotions and my mental state that made me realize I actually need to go back and address this. Otherwise, it's going to significantly affect my health. I'm just going to be chronically stressed for as long as I keep my emotions and my mental state suppressed. And so I actually seeked out professional help. I went to go see a therapist who specialized in sexual trauma. I also um, kept going to my physician, kept going to my optometrist. Basically, I spent almost a year eating right, trying to sleep well, and seeing a therapist for my mental health, but also seeking assistance for my physical health. Um, and it took almost a year for my sight to recover. And healing does take time. If anything, I remember my optometrist telling me, it's almost a miracle you got your vision back. You must have worked really hard for that, because frankly, a lot of times with that condition, it thins out your retina so much, it actually induces permanent semi blindness. Um, and so that was validating in terms of realizing that I was on my way towards healing. But it was definitely a process that required a lot of discipline. I barely, sought out um, a social life. I was just focusing on myself and my healing.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. I'm very impressed that you're able to, for a full year, be so disciplined. I'm just curious. I know some people may be listening who may have been through a similar experience. So, what was the process like for you seeking a therapist, especially someone who focused in sexual assault and trauma? Was that difficult to find someone, or was it just like a simple Google search? What was that process like?
So at the time with my first therapist, I found her through my college resources. So at Berkeley, they offer first initial therapists to meet who will kind of connect you then with someone who specializes in what you're looking for. And so That process was initially stigmatizing because UC Berkeley does not have a great track record when it comes to offering mental health resources for their students. And so actually there was a lot of fear-based conversations from the university healthcare services. I've heard horror stories of therapists being completely oblivious to a student's ethnic background or to their own personal experiences. And because of that, it actually made it more mentally stigmatizing for me to reach out for help. But then afterwards, once I was able to get connected, and I actually got really lucky, I think I met the most amazing therapist through my university, and she, kept checking in on me and make sure I got connected. And so, besides that initial kind of hump, it was a lot easier. I will say though, when I went to go look for a therapist postgraduate season, that was a lot more difficult because I didn't have health insurance after that. After graduating, I was looking for a sliding scale therapist because I was trying to minimize costs. And with those spaces, there's such a long wait line for them. And so oftentimes I would hear that the wait list is almost 6 months to a year ahead.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and when I heard that in my head, I was just thinking, anyone could have a crisis in that time period. Anyone, even someone who is quote unquote mentally very fit and healthy. 6 months to a year is a long time. And so that was extremely difficult. And I think what made it also difficult was for me personally, I want to stick to a woman of color as my therapist. I think that's pretty important to me simply because of, cultural differences, also growing up as a woman in society, that also comes with a lot. And because of that, it was even harder to find what little therapists were out there um, because of those sort of qualities that I was looking for in one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really useful, especially people who are currently in college, knowing that there's at least something on campus that could potentially connect you to someone great, and also post college, where it may be difficult, but it is possible to find someone who's a good fit. That's really great. I'm glad you found some support. And speaking of support, what was your experience like with the people that you're closest to, like your friends and family? Did you feel comfortable sharing your experience with sexual assault with them?
It was a lot easier for me to talk with my friends about my experience. Um, I think I had less fear when it came to talking about them just because I had faith in my friends, um, more than I did for my family, unfortunately. And it also helped that in sort of my generation, what was really popular in college was creating a fake Instagram profile. And a lot of times people used it to post not just personal things that happened in their lives, but also just some of the shenanigans that they were going through in college. And um, I actually made one, and I ended up prioritizing talking about my sexual assault experiences through them. And so you have like your closest circles following that fake Instagram account, or a Finsta, as we would call it. And so it almost became my public journal. I would oftentimes, when I didn't have any logical train of thought, if my thoughts were so disorganized and writing on paper seemed so overwhelming, I would just pull out my phone, spend maybe 20 minutes to an hour just typing out whatever I was feeling and just posting it. And then through those moments when my friends could then engage with that sort of vulnerable content that I was posting, I found a lot of healing through that. And it almost also provided a barrier for me where I wasn't being forced to talk to someone in person about it because I wasn't yet ready for it. But I had that sort of 1 degree away space where I was still reaching out to people. I was still sharing, and I was still getting that validation I needed to heal without the pressure of having to sort of socially censor myself, whether it's like my body language or my facial expressions. And me personally, I have a hard time sharing my personal stories, or I did before. And so getting that sort of Instagram space was really nice. Unfortunately, my family doesn't really follow my fake Instagram account. And so later on down the line, when I had to actually sit down and talk to them about what happened, um, it turned out that a lot of my kind of fearful thoughts about revealing what had happened to me was not unfounded upon. Like those fears were quite justified. Um, I didn't tell my dad about what happened, but I did talk to my mom, and she was pretty callous in response. I remember her exact words, and it was basically, "Who cares? Just get over it. Why dwell on it?" And so I think it came from a place of tough love where she didn't enjoy seeing that I was, stuck in my trauma. But at the same time, it's not that I was stuck. I needed support. And I think there was sort of a miscommunication between me and my mom, or I'd like to think that that was the case. I never brought it up after that. Um, but I remember her saying that, and I actually went back to my therapist and I told her about the experience, and my therapist was just started crying for me. And even though I couldn't get that validation from my mom, I definitely got it through my therapist. And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to have someone in your corner, even if it is someone that is providing professional assistance. It's just, I mean, I can't imagine being in your shoes in that situation. Was there something that made you want to share your story? Or I know you probably were scared approaching your parents to tell them. So was there something that gave you the courage to bring this up to them and the people around you?
So, one of the reasons why it became important to me to just speak about it in general, whether it's my friends or through social media platforms, is because after it had happened, I was actually seeing someone at the time romantically, and they basically placed this burden on me where I have to speak out because I have to prevent my assaulter from moving forward and assaulting other victims. But the reality is that's not the victim's burden to bear. It shouldn't be, the survivor shouldn't have to be forced to share their story over and over again. It should be the assaulter's responsibility to not do such a thing.
Right.
And so even though at the time that was also a very callous response I received, especially when I was in such a raw and vulnerable position, it did stick with me for a long time. I was done once I had, not to say that you've ever finished healing, but when I felt that I was ready, it became apparent to me that the reason why his words sort of stuck was because I did care. I didn't want anyone else to go through the experiences that I did. And not only that, but in terms of when I shared my story, people would reach out and tell me that they had gone through something similar, or that they also knew someone who went through a similar experience, and they were asking me for advice on how do I talk to those people, how do I comfort them, how do I heal them. And so once I addressed my own healing, it became very important for me to also be that source for other people. I think the biggest feeling I felt was an intense loneliness. After it happens, you sort of dissociate from your body. You dissociate from your own headspace. suddenly when you're, moving about day to day in life, it just feels like you're watching someone else kind of take control of the wheels and move the car for you in a way. And so because of that sort of isolation from the self, that also meant isolation from my communities and from relationships. And because of that experience, I just couldn't help but really think, I don't want that to happen to anyone else. In their moment of loneliness, I would hope that, having someone else who also share a similar experience might be able to bridge those gaps, might be able to sort of recenter and reground your own space back to a space of healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, now that's why I sort of want to share my experience and get it out there. Always nice to, also it's just healing for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Constantly reminding myself that I'm not alone in this. Heck, like almost 100% of those women in the cafeteria that was listening to a speaker stood up because they had a
Yeah.
similar experience. And so just moments like that are a great reminder that I'm doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's enough that I'm still here and always focused on my healing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. I'm so glad you are here to share your story because I think it will have a really great impact on so many people. If you could talk to your younger self, what would you tell her now that you've been through this and have come out on the other side as a survivor?
Well, I would tell her the things that she didn't get to hear when she went through that situation. Like, first, I would tell her it's not your burden to share. It's not your burden to protect future potential survivors. Um, Focus on your healing first. And I say this even more now because I actually read Chanelle Miller's book about her experience after the Stanford sexual assault case. And the most poignant thing about that book that really stood out to me was how she talked about, the worst part wasn't necessarily the incident, but the worst part was having to stand up in front of a crowd and constantly have to justify that she was a survivor, that she was a victim in the circumstance. And that experience in and of itself of constantly having to bear yourself out in front of the world over and over again. I just felt so hurt in that moment where, yeah, it shouldn't be her burden to bear. And it definitely like wasn't younger Dianne's burden to bear. That sharing your story should be done initially for your healing if you want it. And if you don't, that's okay too. Um, And then the second thing I would tell her is that assault is assault. I think there's a lot of self-gaslighting that happens after a traumatic experience. I remember some thoughts that I had was, technically, does this count as assault? What counts as a assault? Is there a dictionary definition? Is there an example? Um, Someone please tell me, like, what does that mean? And it really doesn't matter. If your space was violated and if it's keeping you up at night and it's not just about the physical space that's been violated. If it's your mental and emotional space that has been, that is an assault on you. And you shouldn't have to try and define that or justify that in front of other people.
I do kind of want to switch gears just a little bit and kind of go back to what we were talking about before about with your parents and growing up in a Korean American household. I'm just kind of curious how those all kind of intertwine with your journey to healing. So for those of us unfamiliar with the Korean American culture, what was it like growing up in a Korean American household?
I would say kind of the biggest defining factor of my household was that first off, I have divorced parents, and so they divorced when I was really young. So I was raised by my single mom, and so it was a very small household of two. And my mom is more on the liberal side when it comes to Korean values. I think a lot of times she often talks about how she felt suffocated by the Korean values that my father's family sort of projected onto her and her then marriage with my dad. And so um, it wasn't exactly the strictest Korean American household that I think that I'm typically used to hearing about. You know, that tiger mom idea, for example. My mom was really not like that. She was very much, you're my only daughter and I just want you to do the things that make you happy. And so she's a lot more liberal in that regard. And I feel very lucky to have had a mother like her. But I think even so, despite that sort of liberalism, there were expectations being Korean and being an immigrant, in that you always did have to work really hard, even if my mom never explicitly said, told me that I had to do this and get straight A's. I felt it very intrinsically. I felt that I had to work even harder because it was just me and my mom, and so I carried that burden. um, I wanted, to prove to her that she was enough. And for me, a way to prove that was through my own success, whatever that might have looked like. But, and so I carried that burden. My dad's side, on the other hand, they're a lot more patriarchal and traditional. So whenever I did go visit him and his side of the family, all the sort of lectures I received was, you have to marry rich, you have to be a good housewife, you have to, learn how to cook, learn how to clean. Those are the things that give you value in society. And that to me is typically what makes up a very traditional sort of Korean mindset. Um, it's very patriarchal. The man sort of dominates the space and he's the leader, and the women often have to just follow along. And but luckily I was able to distance myself from that because of my parents' divorce, and so it was a very mixed batch in my childhood.
I know that you mentioned your mom's response was, let's say, pretty cold when you told her about your experience with sexual assault. Um, was mental health or any kind of like more of the standard like taboo topics, I guess you could say, were those talked about in your household at all growing up, or were things kind of swept under the rug and just kind of bottled up? What was your experience with that?
My experience was the latter, in that it was completely swept under the rug, bottled up. It's funny because my mom would tell me, like, "You should grow up and, you know, work in the healthcare industry," but she herself would never make a doctor's appointment. And so I found that very ironic, and so, you know, she even had a hard time kind of addressing physical health issues, let alone the mental health ones, and so I never had a discussion on that. We never talked about how we were feeling, in fact, or there weren't really check-ins on how we were doing mentally or emotionally. It was just more very fact of the matter, what happened today. Once you outline that, it's kind of done for that day. And so because of that, when actually before I even mentioned to my mother about my sexual assault, I told her first about therapy, and her immediate response was, "Why? You're not mentally ill. You're mentally very sound. You're intelligent. I don't understand why you're wasting money going to see a therapist when you could just talk to your friends or just deal with it on your own. where's the necessity factor? And so the stigma very much lived, um, even within our household. Mental health was not a separate category of health on its own. Um, and so, despite that, I did try to sort of relay out to her, it's not always about the mental illness. It's not about having schizophrenia or some of these extreme illnesses. It's it's about managing your daily life, managing your emotions, and those are skills that we use in every relationship, including our relationship with ourselves. And she's still on the fence about it, still considers it a waste of money, but at least now her mindset is, well, as long as it helps you, you figure yourself out, fine, but don't ask me to go. And so I just sort of take that as good enough.
Yeah, that sounds like progress.
Progress,
A little
exactly. A
bit.
little.
Yeah. Do you, not to put you on the spot, do you think that you may ever go back and talk to her about maybe like how you felt when she responded or reacted to you telling her about your experience with sexual assault?
That's a really good question. And I feel like I wouldn't, simply because it's something that really did hurt me at the time. And I wouldn't even know how to start that conversation really. I I wouldn't really know how to break that down again, especially when her response was forget the past. It's almost like, well, I'll forget the past, but I won't forget the past part where you told me to forget the past. And I feel like then the conversation would end up going in circles, but who knows? Maybe my own mindset will change. I think at this point in time, I wouldn't see I don't see any value in it. Because I'm also not looking to collect more traumatic experiences. So
Yeah,
I'll probably hold off.
understandable.
Yes.
That makes sense, totally. And kind of going back to learning more about the Korean American culture, um, it sounds like from your experience, it's very misogynistic. And I'm just curious why you think that that culture exists within the Korean American culture. Like, why are there so many misogynistic? I don't say values, but maybe like actions or yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think now that Korea has become such a global townhouse in terms of like media representation, I know everyone's watching like the Squid Game on Netflix, all of that. I mean, Korea has advanced very much technologically in the last sort of 60 years since the Korean War. But if you truly think about civilization and its sort of evolvement, especially with social issues, or not just in social issues. 60 years in general is just not a lot of time. It's very young. And I think even though visually speaking, Korea may look like this first world, quote unquote, developed nation with, high GDP and they're outputting a lot of these products out into the world, socially and culturally, it's still very much catching up. There's a lot of prevailing ideas. They're slow on the uptake when it comes to, you know, for example, like the LGBTQA community and, you know, discussing women's spaces in the workplace and what that might look like. And so I think that is probably one of the reasons why we still see this sort of misogyny in its culture. I mean, Korean values were born from sort of old school Confucian values, in that, um, you're expected as a woman to fulfill this part of a household, and it's almost a confinement. And so when we're talking social issues, it's trying to expand that confinement for women, and that's been a very slow process. I think now it's gotten better simply because actually the rate of marriage has gone down, for example. Korean women age in their 30s, almost a good proportion of them are remaining single. They don't want to get married. And it makes me think about, it's probably because once you fulfill this sort of expectation of marriage, now you have to go back into these more traditional expectations, cooking and cleaning and not working and the filial piety towards like the husband's parents and all those different expectations.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I think, I mean, I don't know your take on withholding or keeping traditions alive, but it's kind of, I don't know, in my opinion, I'm like, oh, it's so great to see like these independent women, working and doing what they want instead of kind of falling into what society expects of them. And it sounds like things are progressing in that respect. So do you feel like in general, the culture can change, and especially in regards to like mental health and emotional health? Like, do you think that the stigma can be addressed eventually, and will people feel more comfortable to talk about their feelings and what they're going through?
I think in general, the culture, it has gotten a lot better in terms of, with social media and sort of globalization of communication. I think a lot of, at least within society, Korean people are realizing, more liberal values exist outside of this society. And so that has definitely helped. A lot of difficult conversations are now taking place. But even so, for example, the idea of feminism is very stigmatized in Korea still. It's almost like a huge backlash anytime a Korean celebrity um, or a woman comes out as a feminist, because it's the idea that it's a man-hating value has prevailed in the country, unfortunately. Um, and it hasn't been reiterated yet that feminism is about respecting a woman's choice. Like, whether it's them wanting to get married and cook and clean, like, of course, like, women can go do that if they want to, or if they want to work in, the workspaces, and they can do that as well. It's really about offering them equal choice and opportunity. But even so, in Korea, like, once you hear the word feminism, it's immediately stigmatized. There's immediate backlash. Oh, a lot of Korean internet, fanatics will come at you and saying things like, you're a man hater and all these things. And I think that because of that, it's like almost like there's a misinterpretation of different liberal values that are happening. Even though Koreans now have access to these ideas through the internet and through globalization, there isn't a proper way to sort of educate them on it and talk to them about, okay, what do things truly mean, and not, you know, passing it on word of mouth. Oh, I heard it means this, I heard it means that, and having a lot of misinformation spread. So I think that's probably a huge limiting factor when it comes to allowing, change to take place in hopefully a very progressive direction. But when it comes to mental health, I think it's also another one of those avenues that Korea is still struggling with. We're still we still have one of the highest rates of suicide in terms of in one of the sort of developed nations statistics, and there's a lot of issues that happen because of that. And so, yeah, probably it's still a work in progress, but something that gives me a lot of hope actually is there are quite a few YouTube channels um, developed by Korean producers in Korea, where they sit down with people of different demographics, ordinary people like you and me, and just ask them questions just like this about what are their thoughts on mental health, what are their thoughts on so-and-so social issues. And when I hear some of the responses, it does keep me hopeful that there are still people who are, being pointed in the right direction and are sort of looking at bigger societal change. Um, so there is progress.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's nice to hear that there are people who are taking those steps forward. And I know it takes so long for things like this to kind of change as a society, and things have been so, stuck in their ways for so long. So to hear that there's even just a little bit of progress is really, yeah, like you said, it's very hopeful. So thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your experience. I greatly appreciate it. Can't thank you enough for being here and taking time out of your day to really talk with me and give people out there some more information about sexual assault, trauma, and just what you've been through. Is I think your recovery journey has been really inspiring. So I'll give you the platform now. If you have anything to share, or if you want your social media to be shared, feel free to share that now with our audience.
I will share my book recommendations. And so right now, I'm reading The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. And just as the title says, it's talking about how even though in your conscious mind, you may not be thinking about some of the traumas that have accumulated, but your body does keep track, and it's keeping me reflective on how my body sort of holds trauma in different spaces and how I can find relief. And then the other book I mentioned, Know My Name by Chanelle Miller, that one was it's a memoir of her own journey, and I found a lot of healing through that book, especially because it was also very similar in terms of my own circumstances. And so just hearing her go through that rigorous court case and getting her story out there, I understand how difficult it is, and it's definitely deterred so many survivors, including myself. But the fact that she did it is inspiring. So I highly recommend those two books.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we'll definitely put the titles and authors in the episode show notes too. So if anyone wants to go check them out, there'll be links there. So thank you again so much for being here. And I hope we can talk again soon and stay connected.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
The To Be Honest podcast is a creative platform that enables youth and young adults to share their personal experience with mental health to help normalize the conversation around this often taboo topic. To Be Honest is a program of Momentum for Health and is supported by District 4 Inventory Funds, Republic Urban Properties, and BetterHelp. To learn more about To Be Honest, visit tobehonest.today or check us out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. The To Be Honest podcast is hosted and edited by Avery Cruz, as well as edited by Peyton Dillahay. Music for the podcast was created by Julia Steele. For more information, check out the episode show notes in the streaming platform of your choice. Happy listening!